Good evening, everyone. My name is Roy Crowhurst. I'm the Vice-Chancellor at the University, and it will be my pleasant duty to welcome you all here this evening. But first, I've been given some housekeeping notes that I must advise you about. The restrooms are just through the doors at the back, over to the left, opposite to the bar. In the case of an emergency, you will see me charging down the centre aisle, and I would strongly recommend you follow me. But seriously, I'm the captain of the ship. I have to be the last one out. So if there's an emergency, we exit through the back doors, and there will be ushers there to guide you to an appropriate way out of the building. And the assembly area is between the academy and the shops area over at the lakes. And the final one, of course, is the usual one about mobile phones. Please make sure they are on silent. So having done that, let me formally and officially welcome you to the first of our winter lecture series for this year. There will be 4 this evenings and 3 more on Wednesday evenings during August. If you haven't got details about those already, I think there are leaflets and there's a lot of information around for them. The Winter Lecture Series are a great opportunity for the University to provide a forum for our researchers, as well as business people from our community, to present their expertise on topics that are relevant to the community. I hope that most of you will know that this is the 50th anniversary of the University of Waikato. We've spent a lot of time during the year reflecting on where we've come from and celebrating our past. But we're now looking forward, and the theme of the Winter Lecture Series is about looking forward. And this evening, it's about business. And as you'll see on the screen, what will business be like in the future? And I'd now like to invite Heather Connolly from our Management School to say a few words as the facilitator for this evening. Heather.
Thank you, Professor Crawford. It is my pleasure to be facilitating this first of the winter series tonight, possibly because it's about business and it's about the future of business, and it's something that I am very passionate about. Not only is my own academic research on knowledge sharing core to business and strategy, but also my real passion is what will business look like for those future generations going forward. So I'm particularly interested to hear insights from our speakers as they talk tonight about what we can expect for the future of business. Tonight we will hear from 4 speakers: Steve Crowhurst, founder and owner of fallenfront.co.nz, an online men's retail store; University of Waikato alumni Chris Insley, the executive director of 37 Degrees South; and University of Waikato sustainability academics and colleagues of mine, Professor Juliet Roper and Associate Professor Eva Collins. But before I hand over to our speakers, I'd like to provide a brief background on them. Steve, as you'll soon hear, is a Raglan local who has worked around the world in sales and production before settling back in his hometown in 2012. He set up Fallen Front, an online fashion store for men. He'd spent 4 years in the UK working in streetwear brands, and then when he came back, he recognised there was a gap in the New Zealand market for men's online fashion. Business for Steve is now booming. He employs 3 staff, and he also outsources a lot of his work. The company stocks more than 40 new and established brands, labels such as, and the young ones will understand this, Huffer, Converse, Vans, and Steve is very stoked to be living what he calls the dream. By the beach, and on a typical day, work for him involves possibly being in the office or being on the surf, or maybe even getting a cup of coffee from Raglan Roast. Chris Insley is the Executive Director of 37 Degrees South, a company he founded in response to the growing global awareness and appreciation by leaders of government and businesses that they really need to start to act in a truly sustainable manner. 37 Degrees South provides innovative and sustainable business solutions for the rapidly evolving business world, particularly in response to climate change. He has many years' experience working with Indigenous groups, governments, agencies and investors in New Zealand and also around the world. Chris has tribal connections to the Mā Tatua, the Tarawhiti, and principally the tribes of Te Whānau o Apanui and Ngāti Porou. He has an MBA and a postgraduate certificate in business research from here at the University of Waikato. Eva Collins is an Associate Professor in Strategy and Human Resource Management at the Waikato Management School. She has a Bachelor of Science with Honours in Political Science from Portland State University, a Masters of Political Economy from Essex University, and she gets around, a PhD in Environmental Public Policy from Georgetown, Washington University. Eva's focus is on business and sustainability. And finally, Juliet Roper is Professor in Management Communications, also at the Waikato Management School. Before coming to the university, she worked in television and also a primary school teacher. Business and sustainability and corporate social responsibility are the focus of much of her current research. Well, with this wealth of experience from our speakers, I am really looking forward to hearing their views, their knowledge, their understanding, and also the challenges they see going forward for future of business. Now, the evening's going to run in the following manner. First, we'll hear from Mr. Crowhurst, then Mr. Insley, and then together Professor Roper and Associate Professor Collins. If you could hold your questions to the end, please, and then when we are finished, we'll open up the floor for discussion, and there will be roaming microphones. If you could please join me in welcoming Steve Crowhurst.
Perfect. Hello everybody, thank you. It's nice to be here amongst such distinguished speakers and guests, so I hope I can offer something interesting for you guys tonight. So I'm Steve, as you heard previously. I'm the owner of a specialised online retail platform selling men's streetwear and apparel to the age groups between 16 and 35, but it's not exclusive to that. So if the younger people here or older people here want to buy something off me, they're welcome to do that. I guess in terms of future business, what my business is all about is I'm not limited geographically, hence it's situated out in Raglan. So how does it work? It's located out in Raglan. I've got an office out there with a warehouse with all the stock and all the clothing, much like your local bricks and mortar store, except all my stock is just packages as it comes sitting on shelves. We've got a photography studio there with all the setup and the appropriate lighting and equipment, and we have a model and a photographer turn up once or twice a week, and we shoot all the new products on the model and also close-up detail shots, and then we use that, which we then put online onto the shop. We've got a few office staff, but I guess because it's online and a lot of it's automated, we don't need as many staff or physical staff dealing with the customers, like a bricks and mortar store. And from there we do all the customer service, all the dispatch, the marketing, the product management and those kinds of things. A courier van comes past 5 o'clock each day. We have all our orders sitting there waiting to go, and we ship guaranteed overnight anywhere in New Zealand and express all across the world tracked, and it's really quite fast. It can get us to Australia in overnight, it can get to Singapore in 3 days, it can get to London in 3 days. The customer can have it, so it's really quite amazing that it can get there that quick. Why have I ended up in Raglan, or what's a little bit of my background to lead me to this? As you heard before, I've been in sales for clothing in both New Zealand, selling Dickies clothing, which is both workwear and streetwear, depending on what you do. I've also been in clothing production, running the local production plant for the manufacturer of Adidas sportswear in Auckland for the rest of New Zealand. And I was also the UK sales manager for Quicksilver Clothing and their surfing products, their wetsuits and sunglasses and watches and that kind of thing over in Cornwall, down in the bottom of England there. And how I came to find out about an online store was that England generally paves the way for online shopping in the world. I suppose they've got so many countries feeding into that epicentre. And I used to go to these online stores and sell my product to them. So I'd hold up some sunnies or a wetsuit or a range of clothing, and hopefully they bought it. And their warehouses were ginormous. The operations were just phenomenal, like couple football field size, just to the roof of stock. And I'm looking at this, and I'd done my 3 to almost 4 years in England, and I thought, I can do this in New Zealand, and I can, more importantly, do it in Raglan, and I can, more importantly, probably live very close to the surf in Raglan and be able to create a business. And Raglan's quite small. There's not many viable jobs out there that might pay the salary I was looking for. So I thought I'd have a go at starting my own business. And the good thing is that I can do it. I don't have to be in Auckland. I've lived in Auckland doing jobs up there. Both myself and the customers are not affected by the location of my business, and I suppose that's obviously down to the internet. The other question is, yes, it's a nice idea, but why would it work in New Zealand? And it works in New Zealand because we're so much further behind England, Australia, USA, with shops like mine, that there was a clear gap in the market. So that was one that made sense. There's also a trend of people shopping online now, and the convenience of shopping online is you can do it at home while you're watching, depending on who you are, Coronation Street, Downtown Abbey, or Game of Thrones or whatever. So you don't even have to leave the house, and you can have some new product arrive the next day. A few stats for you guys about online shopping in New Zealand. 87% of New Zealand households have live broadband. I actually thought it might have been a bit higher, but I guess not everyone needs to be connected to the internet, and our lives would probably be a lot simpler if we didn't have to deal with things associated with the internet. 71% of New Zealanders aged between 25 and 34 shop online, so it's a quite a substantial amount, and it makes me think that why not target these people. There's still a high rate in the higher age brackets, 45 to 54. There's still 58% of those people shop online. It doesn't have to be clothing retail. It can be books. It can be homewares. It can be anything. And even half of the New Zealanders aged between 55 and 64 are active online. New Zealand online sales are growing by 15% each year. So it's compounding. It's quite a substantial amount. Hopefully I can exploit that. New Zealand, only 6% of all New Zealand's retail sales are online, whereas in the UK, it's over 10%. So there's a bit of catching up to do. Apparently we're 8 years behind the UK in our online shopping sort of situation. But an interesting fact is that 19 out of every 20 purchases in New Zealand in the retail sector is still made at bricks and mortar stores. So despite what you hear on the news a lot of the time, even Fair Go and that kind of thing, I know there was something on there last week about online shopping, a lot of people still utilise shopping online. So the next question is that we've got the business set up. I'm in Raglan, it's great. I've got a lot of stock there, which is scary because you have to pay for it, and then you have to sell it, unfortunately. So the question is, how do we get these sales? And there's many forms that, like your social media, that a lot of us like and a lot of us loathe. We have Google. So if you're looking around Google and you type in something that happens to be relevant to my website, in this case, it's this brand up here called Zane Rope. If you were looking for some Zane Rope pants, you'd type Zane Rope, and I've paid for that ad to come up. And that's why Google's so rich, because a lot of people pay for that to happen to drive traffic to their stores. You have Facebook, which you all know what that is. We have Instagram, And these are just the more casual approach to showing your customers what you generally do and the look and feel of your store. And so that's flashing up from a few trips, a bit of our product. We have a database of every person that buys something. We keep their details. We have permission, of course, and we can email them, keep them updated. There's social influencers. There's a group of kids called the Just Uni Kids who do videos across the internet, and they've got a massive following just because it's interesting on Facebook, so we'll use them to talk about us. You have digital partnerships, so we have a partnership with the Rhythm and Vines Festival down in Gisborne, and as you can see, there's one of our ads across their social site. And then we've got radio and other things like that. Just to show you the inner workings under the hood, if you like, of an online shop. Google gives you this great tool where you can actually see what happens. Pretty much you know everything about everyone that comes to your website except for their name and obviously who they are. So right now this is live, this is what's happening. I've got 13 people walking around my store, and you can see what they're looking at here, and you can see how many people are there, and it can suck up a lot of time watching, hoping that you can see when they're at the checkout, you can see when they leave the checkout, you can see when they come back. So that's really, really helpful. And we can find out other stuff like where are they from. And I'll finish there, but I'll just show you some countries about the type of countries, how far away the countries are that I'm selling to. Let's see if I can do this. So this is over a month. We have had visits from all of these countries, Spain, Russia, Malaysia, Belgium, Finland, Greece, Pakistan. I haven't sent anything to Pakistan, but someone there's looking. So that's the hopefully a bit of an insight into the future of an online shop and the way we do business and how I'm not restricted to being in a big city centre and working traditional 9 to 5 hours. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Look, I know you've probably got some great questions brewing there for him, but please hold them to the end. I found it very inspirational because I do a little bit of online shopping myself, but it was great to hear some of the statistics in terms of what age groups are actually doing the online shopping. Now, without further ado, I'd like to invite Chris Insley up to speak about his work. Please welcome Chris.
Just check the technology. Steve said to me that he's into surfing, and you heard that I'm from Te Whānau Wapanui in Ngāti Pro. So we've got this amazing coastline, and he said, yeah, and I figured out that I want to go surfing there, but I was told that I had to take 2 boxes of Steinies with me when I go around there to get access to the land to go surfing. You're right, Steve? Ka tira, kia ora tātou. He mihi atu ki a koutou, koutou ngā kai ako o tēnei te whare wānanga o Waikato, ka mihi atu ki a koutou. Ka mihi atu ki e tahi o koutou, koutou ngā kaimahi I roto I tēnei te whare wānanga o Waikato, ka mihi atu ki a koutou. Me e tahi o koutou no tēnei whenua no Waikato tainui, ka mihi atu ki a koutou, huri no ki a koe roi, ka mihi atu ki a koe me tuhuna e tahi o ngā mihi o tō tātou nei pāpā, Uncle Api, ki a koe, he hoa no tō tātou pāpā. Just briefly, I'd like to just translate. I greet you all as either teachers, lecturers here at the University of Waikato, and maybe some of you are students, so I greet you as well. But I also send special greeting to any of you that may be from here, from Tainui. But also, and finally, a greeting from our chairman, Dr. Apirana Mahuika, who is a friend of Roy's. And so I send to Roy a greeting from our chairman, Uncle Api. Kia ora no tātou. Now, I've been told that I've got 20 minutes. I've got about 20 slides, and I've said I won't go any over 20 minutes. So I'm going to launch straight into it. A little bit of a different kind of theme from what you've just listened to with Steve. I also got told by Nicola that I had 20 minutes, and she told me actually what I had to talk about and what I couldn't talk about. And I said, yeah, okay, I'll talk about those things, Nicola, but I'm also going to talk about some other things. So I want to share with you some practical examples of some of the stuff that I'm involved in. So these are the kind of things that we jointly agree that I want to talk about. It's to share with you some of the things that are going on in the Māori economy, and related to that, this issue about leadership. That's happening across the Māori economy, and then talk about some of the work that I'm involved in this space of sustainability and especially climate change internationally and domestically here in New Zealand. And I will be provocative too. There's some stuff that I'm going to share with you that's pretty provocative. Now, this is the stuff here that Nicola told me that I wouldn't spend too much time on, so I won't. But I want to actually share with you some practical examples I think of some of maybe the theoretical things that we live and talk about in institutions like this, but actually show you some of how these things that I'm involved in, we're actually rolling out on the ground, and they go from very big things to very, very small community things, but I think they're all important. So this thing about leadership. So Nicola said, have a talk about what's going on in leadership in the Māori economy. And so I actually kind of like, there's all these theoretical models. I reckon that this guy has got some good thinking about how to define leadership. This guy, Colin Powell. And one of the things that, he's got 14 lessons. The first one of those lessons is that if you're going to be an effective leader, you've got to be prepared to piss people off. And if you're not prepared to do that, you're really going to be quite an ineffective leader, because according to this guy, and I believe he's right, that sometimes in organisations, the army's no different. If you're not an effective leader, and if you're not prepared to actually take people to task when they need to be, you're not going to be an effective leader. So it's kind of one of the themes that I want to sort of roll through tonight with you. Another one is about building smart teams and looking for really, really strong, capable people and bringing those people around you. And this is certainly something that we as Māori have really clicked to. And it's growing our people through institutions like Waikato and, in fact, the best universities across the world. And lastly, this kind of principle, and I want to try and illustrate these principles in some practical examples. According to this guy, and I agree with him, the greatest leaders are people that can simplify things. They can boil down all the technical jargon, all the buzzwords and all the rest of it, and paint a really, really clear, simple picture, the way forward that people believe in and they get behind and follow. And one of the guys I'm going to kind of use to paint that picture is Uncle Api shortly. What's going on in the Māori economy? Why I want to actually share this with you, it's quite important because it's quite significant, not just to Māori but to New Zealand. Here's a piece of work that was done by Dr. Ganesh Nana from Burl a couple of three years ago, and he started to put some numbers around what was happening in the Māori economy. And effectively what he concluded is it's big, $37 billion, and it's concentrated in the primary sectors where we own collectively around half the fishing industry in New Zealand is owned by Māori. Around 30 to 40%, and through a number of different streams, in farming is owned by Māori. In forestry, increasingly 30 to 40%, and it'll just keep growing in time. So these primary sectors have a huge, if you like, Māori ownership and influence, which is important to understand going forward. Here's something to also understand. I actually did these numbers, not Ganesh. So Ganesh actually, what he did was he measured the Māori economy, then he measured the non-Māori economy, and that's what these graphs talk about. There's the $37 billion. Here's the non-Māori economy at this level here. But the real important thing, I think, the lesson in terms of thinking about the future is if you do the numbers and understand, do the maths, and how quickly these two, if you like, separate economies, and we think of them as separate economies, are growing. This one is growing at about 15 to 17% year on year, Māori economy. This one, the rest of the economy is growing about 3 or 4%. If you roll those numbers forward, so if they continue to grow at that rate, what might the future look like? And that's what this graph here paints a picture of. If they continue to grow at that rate, by about, somewhere around about there, the Māori economy will be about the same size as the non-Māori economy. And that's just on the basis of what we see going on around us at the moment. I guess the real challenge is, can the Māori economy continue to grow at its current rate? And I've got some examples of companies that I'm directly involved in, one of which is growing at more than 17% year on year, at around 20%. So the answer to that I have is that yes, it's growing fast and it'll become a major component of the New Zealand economy going forward. And as Māori, we think differently around how we run our businesses. We think of them as long-term businesses, 100 years and more. That's the same sustainability, if you like, driver. Climate change. I want to sort of turn it, and the relationship between climate change and sustainability, well, I think for everyone in the room you'll agree there is a common thread there. As iwi, we've been having a major discussion with the Government of New Zealand around what we think good policy might look like for New Zealand, and certainly in terms of our interest as Māori. Here's our chairman, this great leader. This is Uncle Api here, talking with Naira Glavish. And one of the other hats that I wear is I'm a member of the New Zealand negotiating team out there in the United Nations, trying to actually get good policy internationally. My job, as Uncle Api, our chairman, tells me, is to interpret that, bring it home and tell all the iwi what happened out there in the international space and what it means for us. So I've been a member of that negotiating team for a number of years. These are the drivers that I talk about, long-term commitment, intergenerational. It's different from non-Māori businesses. And again, I can attest to that for some of the other work that I'm involved in. But we're not just interested in the hard cold numbers, like the NPV and the return on investment. We're interested very much so in how any investment might grow our people at home, might take care of the environment, and ultimately, if we're doing these things right, we will grow our identity as Māori, our culture. And that's the way we think about sustainability. It's an integrated way of thinking about things, it's a holistic way of thinking about things, and it's a long-term way of thinking about things. Some of you, this is something that iwi leadership group under Uncle Api have been basically at loggerheads with the New Zealand government for the last 5 or so years. And this is really what it's all about. I don't want to get into the detail, but some of you might be intimate with the detail. The primary instrument that New Zealand has as a policy instrument in Wellington is a price on carbon, price on emissions. Now, because of some things that the government did, this is where it's going to get a bit controversial here and provocative. The government did some things in Wellington, and I won't go into all of the detail, happy to talk through the detail if anyone wants to know, but they did the wrong things. And this is what happened to the price of carbon. It collapsed. It collapsed down to almost an embarrassingly almost 0 point like Australia. And when that happened, because iwi are big in the primary sector, it cost iwi $600 million. But then it got worse. I think, then it got worse. Here's some research. This is highly controversial. Here's some research that iwi leadership group have just commissioned through a chief economist that's the advisor to Treasury on climate change policy. And we asked this chief economist to do some numbers for us and said, what's going on out there by the big polluters in terms of this collapse in this carbon price? As you can see, it follows the same basic line. And mindful of time, but all I want to say to you, and I'm happy to go through the detail, over this last 3-year period, the government have stood by and allowed the polluters in New Zealand, the energy companies, to price gouge. When every single one of us goes to the petrol pump, for every litre of petrol and diesel that's been sold, every unit of electricity that's been purchased in the last 3 years, we've all been price gouged by the polluters in this country to the tune of $1.4 billion. So this is a big discussion, substantive discussion that iwi leaders are having with John Key right now in the lead up to the election. I move on. Iwi leaders went to the government the end of last year and said, you need to fix this problem about this price on carbon because people are leaving the emissions trading system, and we put a proposal to them. Fix it to $15 through our chairman here, and if they did that, this would create 100,000, would attract the necessary investment to plant 100,000 hectares of new forest per year for 10 years, double the size of the New Zealand forest industry. Oops. Help. It would restore 400 of the $600 million that it would lost. It would attract $800 million, no cost to the taxpayer. This was all done by an independent economist at Infometrics. Would create 50,000 new jobs across the economy, new and permanent jobs, targeting the 1.2 million hectares of Māori land. and address some of the worst soil erosion in the world, the government rejected it. This is a no-brainer, but they rejected it for political reasons. I'm going to move on. Some of the sustainability projects that I'm involved in directly. Here's one. This is the business I mentioned to you that's growing at 20% a year. It's the only 100% in Kawerau, only 100% Māori-owned geothermal assets company. Last 10 years has grown year on year at 20%. Amazing story, this. And however, one of the things that I know sitting on the board of that organisation, it does have some vulnerabilities. And that is, in order to sustain that growth, the risk it has, we sell energy to the pulp mills in Kawerau. If anything happened to those pulp mills, our business is under threat. So we've been looking at ways to diversify that business into a whole lot of other smart things and engage some of the best thinkers in the world to help us on that journey. I'll come to that shortly. Here's another project. So this is a kind of a smaller project, a community project that we've got in the Eastern Bay of Plenty, and it's about the rising cost of energy. It's going like that. Small communities, Māori rural communities, fixed incomes. So if the price of energy goes up, fixed incomes, small communities, rural communities feel that problem the worst. So we've been trying to find a way to actually create renewable, community-owned energy company, and we're getting there. We started doing a few things like this, and now we've moved on to actually, this is some of our drivers, cheap energy for the whānau, energy security, create jobs. And we had done this amazing project. We got all these bright young minds from not Waikato University, sorry, Roy, Auckland University, Canterbury University, Auckland Institute of Technology, fourth year engineering students to come and work with us and try and solve this problem. Awesome exercise. These are these kids on our marae, and we picked the top 3. And here's the 2 top proposals that we're now working through another process with some really, really full-time engineers to turn those things into a reality. We've got Chapman Tripp working with us to set up these new companies that are owned by our community. Here's the energy project in here. Won't go through all the detail. We've got a land-based aquaculture project out the side here that's happening through my work in Ngāti Porou. That project is moving along, and we're looking to do the greenhouse development thing there as well. That's in a small community in the Eastern Bay of Plenty called Maio. And we've got the strategy of finding the best people. Here's the best people that we've got in this country that are actually working with us, along with Chapman Tripp, to actually make this thing real. This stuff is, you can, if you want to know any more about this stuff, you guys can get it. But they are the best people in this country with international experience, working alongside our commercial advisors from Chapman Tripp on our project to create this renewable energy business that we own. Here's the work that I mentioned earlier on, our geothermal assets company. It's about how do we actually make that company sustain itself over the long term and protect it from anything that might happen to the wood industry in Kawerau. So this initiative is around how do we use steam energy to create high-value food. And I've been, for the last 2 years, tripping around through Europe, through London, through Switzerland, France, Germany, there's another country in there somewhere, and visiting the best food innovation institutes across Europe with a view to finding the best people, the best technologies, and bringing these people home to New Zealand to work with us on some of these projects. Next week, we will contract here, the Wageningen Institute out of the Netherlands, to bring their team of experts around greenhouse development to work with us for 4 months to build the business case. By Christmas, we'll have the business case, and as our chairman, Uncle Api, says, well, once you've got the business case, call a hui. Bring us all together. These are the chiefs of iwi. And 5 of these guys, collectively, they sit over the top of a balance sheet of around $500 million, looking to invest in this particular project. That's stage 1. Stage 2 is how do we actually might use the output from this, whether it's flowers or food or whatever, and feed those into subsequent processes to get ourselves from being basically at the low value end of this value chain to the very, very high end of this value chain into things like nutraceuticals. And so these are all of the people that have kind of mapped out already, and I'm talking to it right now around them bringing their teams to work with us in Kawerau and with other Māori around the country off the back of this initial piece of work over the next 4 months. We're really rapt. These are some of the best thinkers in the world. They're going to come and sit down with us and bring their knowledge and share that with us to grow that business even further and continue that growth of 20% year-on-year growth. It's pretty cool. And as part of that, through my tripping around through these countries through Europe, here's the people that we're talking to currently. These are these institutes, incredible institutes. It's mind-boggling and quite scary, actually, some of the research that you see some of these people doing, sort of Frankenstein stuff. Seriously, you see this amazing woman in Germany talking about extending the lifespan of worms 4 times. And she said, oh, and we can even reverse that too. We can halve it. And you know where the story is going. But for us as Māori, it's looking to find these partners and form these relationships practically and get them down here on the ground and working with us. And I can tell you, they are really looking forward to it. And they put a lot of value on the fact that we are Indigenous people that think very, very long term. They put a lot of value on that. Interestingly, the Germans particularly most strong, and then as well the Dutch. Here's another project. Don't have time, or I would have shown you this short video about some work we're doing with a tribe in British Columbia. They've done the renewable energy stuff already. Their whole community is powered by renewable energy, and now they're moving on to other stuff. It's really cool. But just don't have the time to show you the short video. So we're using their information and their ideas to help move our stuff forward a lot faster. It took them 10 years. Our objective is to achieve some of these outcomes in the next 2 years, even though members of my project team keep telling me, you're going too fast, you're going too fast. But I take my lead from our Crowhurst. They tell me, no, kia kaha, mahi atu. They tell me, get on with it, do it. So unfortunately, I can't show you that video. I think you would have really enjoyed it. But so that's in the southern tip of Vancouver Island. And we're working with a lot of other Indigenous people too, on a whole lot of different fronts. Here's my last, I heard the bell going there. My last slide. So sustainable development, it's something that fundamentally underpins who we are as Māori. We'll have a different way of thinking about these issues, but we'll be a major part of this economy going forward, as you can see from some of those slides up, those graphs that I put up there. And I think, and this is one of the views that I think some of the European people that we've linked up with enjoy, that, you know, having this kind of, you can think and plan for the long term, that has to be a good thing. That not just for Māori, I think it has to be a good thing for New Zealand. And I'm observing that this is something that's growing around the world. But we also have an important and I think unique leadership role to play. I could go into a lot of detail, but my tripping around through Europe, the Europeans and some of those countries up there, they are bilingual, like Māori. They are bilingual, and they buy into this kind of bilingual view that we have as Māori, and so therefore we can talk readily together about commerce and a whole lot of other things. And key to this is my last point, the world's best knowledge and partnerships are fundamentally key to our strategy. So that's it, and I don't think I've gone over time. Kia ora no tātou.
Well, that was a lovely talk, and I know that there'll be lots of questions in terms of some of the stuff that more detail on some of the stuff that you have raced over to cover so much in there. So what I'd like to do with it is invite our last 2 speakers up, Professor Juliet Roper and Associate Professor Eva Collins, to share with us some insights on sustainability and business practices. So thank you.
I didn't touch a button. She gave me the controls. You know we're in trouble. Okay, so we're going to do a sort of tag team approach to this talk and talk about our research, but largely where our research is leading us to think about the future. And the overall approach we're going to take is one that a colleague and I have been using more and more in our classes with our postgraduate students, and this is a scenarios approach. looking at scenarios, planning and thinking ahead, looking at where we are now, what are the key driving forces that are pushing change or not pushing change, and what might happen if particular driving forces intersect. And you'll see that our whole presentation will follow this format. Okay, so where are we now? Now, this picture is not meant to directly point a finger at farmers or farming, but it is a representative image of where we are now with our environmental situation. We do have environmental problems, we do need to address them, and we are not addressing them as well as we might. What we sometimes need to take a step back from and think about is that for a sustainable society, a sustainable planet, a sustainable country, whichever perspective you're taking, we have to think about the balance between government, business and society. And the balance shifts depending on swing of ideological views, economic situations, but essentially each sector is dependent upon the other, and the balance of power and responsibility shifts according to circumstances at a given time and place. Now, if we're talking about where are we now still, the government in New Zealand adopts a free market approach. Along with that is generally, as far as possible, a hands-off approach when it comes to social and environmental legislation, especially environmental. Sorry. Maybe I better hold that thing. So business, largely, not entirely of course, but largely a voluntary approach to environmental and social impacts, and society to this day remains largely identified as consumers, but there is evidence that this is shifting.
So part of our research looked at the discourse or the language that policymakers, public officials use. So let me share two quotes. I have my glasses with me. Share two quotes from the same agency, Ministry of Economic Development. The first one's from 2008. Sustainability is firmly at the heart of the New Zealand government's agenda. It underpins the government's themes of economic transformation, national identity, and families. Same agency in 2010, the overarching goal of the government is to grow the New Zealand economy, to deliver greater prosperity, security, and opportunities for all New Zealanders. So you can see in the quote from 2010, the language that's used, sustainability is dropped right off, and economic development is given priority. And so what does it matter what the language or the discourse that public policy decision makers are using? And what we found in our research is that the language that public policy makers use is reflected in the media. And this is just an example from the New Zealand Herald tracking the word sustainability and its derivatives like sustainable development. And you can see that it peaks in 2008 and then drops down quite significantly. And we know that a lot of people use the media to inform themselves about issues. And so if it's not discussed, it's difficult to be informed. Another part of the research that we've conducted has tracked the uptake of social and environmental practices by businesses in New Zealand since 2003. And what jumps out, I don't have Chris's little light, but what jumps out is the no one. So at a time when many people would consider that we have increasing environmental concerns, what companies are saying to us is that there's no pressure to adopt environmental practices. And you can see that by the central government results as well. The other results I note on this slide is the steady but growing pressure from consumers, still not big at 30%, but continues to increase over the years. And in our research, consumers tended to be not individual consumers that businesses were experiencing the pressure, but business-to-business pressure.
Okay, and this is the last slide looking at where we are now, and it's just to show that we're not alone in New Zealand. Alarmingly, internationally, and this is research done across 18 countries up until 2012, concern about major environmental issues, including climate change, has dropped off considerably, and you can see how it's tracking. So you would assume that a reduced concern would mean a reduced drive for action. Okay, so what are the key driving forces for change? We would say that 3 of the top ones are social demands, resource constraints, and enabling technologies, and we'll take a quick look at an example of each of these. Okay. From the social demand perspective, we can see a direct impact when we look at the policies that big international, well, these are all UK-based, but globally reaching supermarkets. They know through their research that there is a growing trend of consumers wanting sustainably derived products. And they are wanting to keep ahead of the curve so that they can guarantee their customers that everything they buy in their supermarkets, they've already done the work, they know that it is sustainable. And this does have a flow-on effect for us. One in particular is that the pressure to get these sustainably derived products flows on down the supply chain, and that includes New Zealand. So there is an impact coming.
So Juliet and I have done some work with New Zealand's Sustainable Business Council, and it's linked with the World Council for Sustainable Development. And what they did was they got together the top scientists in the world, and the work is called Planetary Boundaries, looking at where we're putting the most pressure on our resources. And the Sustainable Business Council in New Zealand has some of the top businesses in New Zealand, and what they did was they took that information and they said, what's our vision for New Zealand in 2050? So quite a long-term outlook, not quite as long as 100 years, but long for business. What's our vision? What do we want? And then they use that as a platform for action. What do we need to do? What do we need to put in our business plans in 2020 if this is the vision we want for 2050? The other thing I'll just note on this graphic is that when we're looking at these issues, it really requires a systems approach. You can't separate climate change out from water, out from biodiversity. They're all quite linked, and that makes it a little bit complicated sometimes. Another key driving force is enabling technologies, and Steve talked about that with his new business model with online business. Another example, and I have some of my students out here smiling because they know the story is all good bananas. There are significant negative social and environmental impacts the way commercial bananas are grown. And this is your fun fact to take away tonight. New Zealand is the largest consumer of bananas per capita. I know, fascinating. And yet there's these negative consequences. And so a group of Kiwis got together and said, right, we're going to form a company. Initially there was 5 of them, and we're going to import the first in New Zealand fair trade, third-party certified bananas. So they have to meet certain social and environmental standards. And so there's 5, and they're up against these big multinational corporations. It seems like a grim story, right? They use social media, and they do fantastic. And so they have 5% of the New Zealand banana market. It's worth millions of dollars. Pretty darn good for 5 of them. And yet here's the other side of the technology story. Of course there was a competitor response. Dole looks over at them and says, actually, we're ethical. And no, we're not going to go to a third party to certify that we're ethical. we're going to put a sticker on our bananas. And so when you're a shopper with a nanosecond to make that banana purchase decision, and Dole has their ethical, self-certified ethical choice, and All Good has their fair trade, it's hard to know the difference. And so the other side of the technology story, though, is that businesses are a lot more transparent, whether or not they want to be transparent. So it goes through social media, and the ethics of what Dole is doing starts getting talked about. There's a complaint with the Commerce Commission because felt like that Dole was misleading consumers, and they have to withdraw that sticker. So thinking back again about that graphic that Juliet started with about the balance between business, government, and society, here's a quote from Dow Chemical that I want you to think about. The current world order or disorder is based on entrenched and dysfunctional systems with no one person, one company, or one government at the controls.
Okay, so where does sustainable balance lie? And we think that it is beginning to shift. So just want to bring you back to this shift, and then we'll move straight on with the scenario thinking. When you do scenarios planning, you choose two driving forces and you plot them against each other as an X and Y axis. And you start to look at what might happen if they intersect. So what we did with this one, and this is not necessarily looking terribly far out into the future, and so it's not really radical, but I think it's radical in terms of what we have in a number of institutions in New Zealand today as an entrenched way of thinking. Now, across the x-axis, as you can see, we have an inactive society moving through to an active one, and the y-axis is business change versus business as usual. Now, if you plot an inactive society, a society that doesn't care, doesn't pressure its government for change or doesn't pressure business for change, and business doesn't change on its own, the graphic, I mean, I had fun choosing some graphics, but I think it gives the picture. But I don't think that is where we are. I think that we have some steady movement up into that top left-hand quadrant, and a lot of businesses are making headway. Chris is talking about Maori business. It's embedded in the way they think. Dole bananas. There are lots of examples in New Zealand. So we are seeing this shift. But we want to go further, and we want to say, okay, what if you get this business changing, but there are not enough businesses are changing? So maybe, and our research shows this, that there are many who are still down in the lower left quadrant. And then if you get business changing, but you also get an active society, which we are, as we said, there are indications that this is stirring up more and more, then what we predict is happening, and there are indications, especially internationally, that this shift is just coming. Businesses are starting to call on government to legislate, to bring in what they're calling smart legislation. And we can speculate as to the reasons for this, but I would say that one of the strongest one is to produce a level playing field, so that those first movers in business who were looking for increased profits from their competitive advantage, but the laggards, the business as usual lot, have not come forward fast enough, and perhaps society has not been as active as we might have hoped. Their outlay in changing their systems has been quite high, and they may not be getting the returns that they'd hoped. But if legislation is brought in for example, around emissions, for waste, for water consumption and any other range of criteria you want to think about, then others are forced up and the playing field is levelled. We predict that the shift is coming into that top right-hand quadrant more quickly than many would think. Okay, and straight to the last, what we want to put to you is, what if we're right? This is controversial. There are many who, for one, would discount scenarios planning. They say it's speculation, but better with foresight rather than hindsight. And if we are right, what are the consequences? What are the consequences for us as citizens and consumers? What are the consequences for doing business? And that's the one most pertinent tonight. And what are the consequences for government? And maybe more so as election year comes up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juliet and Eva. I think that leaves us with some really quite interesting things that we can ask some questions around. All of our speakers tonight have talked about exploring what potential we have for the future, and also that there is a tension between exploring and the exploitation that is also happening from some business, from government, and also from society. So I open it up to the floor for questions for our speakers.
Of being fair and honest with people. The biggest thing I think that is a problem for us throughout the world, undoubtedly, is the growth of financial crime throughout the world. And I'm surprised to a small degree that you can be so confident about the Maori future in business without also addressing the possibility of financial crime within your ranks, and also the financial crime which will be used in order to try to combat even with what you are trying to do for the Maori people. We must look that the New Zealand Society of Business has been based on the idea that there will be Maori availability of poorly financed support workers. Gradually we're losing that, and that's good. We're moving to the island people, and that's bad. And we're moving to any people in the world, that's bad. It's time that the white people obviously started to face up to the fact that everybody in this world is equal to everybody else, and everybody should enjoy the same kind of possibilities.
Obviously, I guess that question is aimed at me. So I'll have a crack at answering it. If I understand the question, you made the point about the prospect of financial crime both within the Māori ranks and the wider ranks, if you like. I think if I understand your question, here in New Zealand in the wider ranks, given what's happened, given the global financial crisis. So if I understand that that's your question, is what is the concern, or does that pose an issue for Māori going forwards? I think there was a second question in there too, going forwards. And I guess the answer to that question, if I understand it correctly, you're going to get financial problems in wherever you go, in any financial market, and we're seeing that all over the world. We're seeing that here in New Zealand, not just with Māori. I think the way certainly for us to think about that issue is to take a long-term view. You know, where do we want to be in the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 50, 100 years from now? And sure, we might get something that happens at some near point, but that doesn't, if you like, distract us from where we want to be over the long term. If I understand that that's your question. So we take a long-term view, and like it's not an issue that's particular to Māori, that somebody goes off the rails and does something. That's something that's universal around the world. But the difference that we have is we won't be distracted over where we want to get to over the long term. So I'm not sure if I understand your question. And your last point that you made was the point about everybody's equal. I couldn't agree more.
As I say, it's time that we all came to terms with this and appreciate it.
Yes, I completely agree. And I guess that's the point I'm pointing to up there. If I use the example there where government policy was discriminatory to the tune of $600 million against Māori interests in favour of polluters.
That was one of the things that stimulated me, the fact that you had lost the support of government purely on political reasons.
Well, look, it wasn't a political reason. The reason they did it was that, and this gets to the point that Juliet's made, it was that there was a strong lobby group in New Zealand that had a vested interest that lobbied the New Zealand government, and these were the polluters, the energy companies. And they basically lobbied that the government drive the price of carbon down, which they did.
Which segues, if I may say so, into quite a nice thing that I'd like to put to the two professors about key drivers. What happens when key driver greed meets the y-axis of enough, running out? I'll leave it with you.
That is a scenario which could happen. I would hate to see it happen. It would be universally disastrous. And again, I think, well, one would hope that at that point society would be in such a state that citizens would stand up and demand of their government that something change. Well, one would hope, and this is why we talk about the balance between business, government and society. When one sector gets out of kilter too much, the others step up and increase pressure.
Yeah, I just want to add to that I think we start going down a slippery slope when we talk about economic well-being as separate from environmental well-being. And that that's an old pattern, and instead what we like to talk about is that when business starts to pay attention to the environment and pay attention to its people, it almost always makes good economic sense as well, and so they don't have to be in conflict.
Gentleman down here.
Hi, first of all, I just wanted to say thanks to all the presenters tonight. It's very enlightening, each one of your presentations. My question is for Steve. Just wondering what one of your biggest challenges has been since you've started your online business.
That it's not limited by geography and the fact that the whole world's my competition. So I thought I was smart, sort of been able to suck everyone else in, but they're also sucking from the big businesses offshore. So that's probably the biggest shock and the biggest factor. Thanks.
Yes, down the back, sir.
My question is for the two professors. I'm not an academic, I'm just an observer, but I applaud the quadrant. I hope that we can aspire to the top right-hand quadrant. But aren't we, if we wish to be the rock star of the examples in the world, aren't we stifled by globalisation, if not the initiatives around the Pacific for various contracts, the FTAs or the TPP? Because don't we have to comply with other jurisdictions when it comes to their policies? Do you understand my question?
Well, I think I understand what you're saying. A lot of the trends we've noticed are actually coming from outside New Zealand. And that's going to have a flow-on pressure onto New Zealand. I'm not talking about New Zealand in isolation at all, and I think it would be a big mistake for us to ever think of ourselves as in isolation, because we're not.
But in response to that, I find Kyoto and Copenhagen to be disasters when it comes to us wishing to implement some good climate change policies. We've been stifled by the world position on the various programs. So surely we must, to some extent, isolate ourselves if we want to implement the top right-hand quadrant.
Climate change is a global problem. There's no putting up a wall and defending yourself from climate change. And there's been a lot of argumentation in New Zealand that we're small, our impacts are small, and we should not do anything ahead of the bigger polluters. And that, again, is a matter of opinion, one which I would strongly disagree with. There is a lot of movement amongst European countries in particular towards reducing carbon emissions. It's been increasingly built into policy. Other countries are doing it in different ways. I agree, it's a problem when everybody is not in step, but I don't think that any of us can afford to sit back and wait.
Okay, I'm going to sound like Pollyanna a little bit, I realize, but I'm going to go for it anyway. So I see that as an opportunity, and I see it as an opportunity because Steve made the comment that, what are we, 6 years behind, did you say? And that happens with issue after issue, and so we can look globally and see what the trends are and be smarter about it. And so I think because of our size, because of our edge of the world positioning, that actually we can take a more innovative approach. But again, that sounds a little bit Pollyanna.
Just a brief comment to that point. And having sat in Copenhagen, sat in those different discussions around the world, and it is like watching paint dry in those discussions. People arguing, countries arguing about where to put a comma in a line. But I think the point, I really want to tie it back to the point that Juliet made in her presentation, and that was that in 2008, we had government policy in New Zealand led by Helen Clark. And the graph showed that there was strong uptake, both here domestically, but my point is also internationally. New Zealand, under that government leadership, was seen as being a global leader in this space, despite our small size. A lot of the big nations of the world were looking to New Zealand, despite our small size. And now, subsequent to Helen Clark's departure and change in government, New Zealand is being shunned by some of these same companies because of the policy shift that has occurred here in New Zealand in those international discussions.
Another question from the floor. Make it our last question. No? Okay. Well, we've got, yes.
Sorry, because there's no other questions. I've got one for Chris. 15 years ago, I was involved with Māori commerce, and I was asked by the New Zealand Māori Council to come on and assist them in their kaupapa. And I was sitting in a hotel lobby with Sir Graham Latimer, and he says, Brian, if you want to come on board, that's fine, but the bus has got 16 steering wheels. Māori commerce. In other words, the bus was dysfunctional, and I'm talking about leadership. And of course, he was at the helm of the leaders. And I did experience that 16-wheel bus. That was 15 years ago. And I applaud your comment about if you want to be a good leader, you've got to piss some people off. My experiences with Māori commerce was there were 16 pissed off steering wheels, all pissing on each other. Your succinctness must suggest to me that when it comes to leadership, Māori have sorted out their backyard, or do we still have the difficulties of mana whenua and each each group, I was going to say iwi, but each group of Māori wishing to drive their own destiny?
Yeah, good question. The answer to that is all of the iwi in the country, they still retain their own separate identity, and they still have all their own internal struggles, and they still all have their own individual steering wheels. But importantly, what I've observed is, and I used two examples, well actually one example I put up there, was where there are common interests. In my observation, working with this group of leadership over the last 5 or so years, where there is a common interest, it's very, very simple. In fact, frighteningly quick at how things can actually happen among that group where there is common interest. And so I used the example of the geothermal work that we're doing and bringing the people from Vakanen. So I talked to the leaders, and I mean the leaders, the elected leaders of 5 iwi that have geothermal steam. And I said, would you be interested in having a discussion around this when we've got the business case? They basically said, call a meeting when you've got the business case, and we'd really like to participate in that discussion around co-investment. That's one example. Another example that I'll use is fishing. I've been involved in setting up a fishing joint venture with Māori that involved 12 iwi. That was 12 iwi trying to bring together all of their small lots of quota to actually create some scale in order to actually create some leverage out there into the marketplace. Put the business case together, and getting those 12 iwi to sign that document wasn't hard. And actually the scary thing about it is we've now got 6 more iwi saying, well, where do we sign? So why do I think that it's happening like that? What's changed? I guess one of the things that I've observed is Māori have trained a lot of their own people. Sent them off to university and study fishing industry, study farming, study commerce, study law. And it's actually Māori now developing their own solutions. And so when you have a Māori person taking a proposal to a group like that, because it is a Māori person with shared values, it's actually, I'm finding and observing, they're very ready to buy into it. But I come back to your point, are there still the many steering wheels out there? Yes, there are many steering wheels out there, but I don't think that's particular to Māori. But where there is a common interest, my observation, it's actually commerce among Māori can happen very, very quickly.
Okay, I'll have one more.
Just one comment about the visibility of the steering wheels in whichever sector of society the steering wheels are more or less visible. I just saw Alistair Barry's film Hot Air on the politics of New Zealand's attitude to climate change, and there's so much of what was done was not, the information wasn't available to the rest of us in society. I highly commend the film. It's devastating critique of how policy is formed in New Zealand.
Thank you. And I think that point, we have a lot more transparency today, and therefore I think with all the comments that have come from our speakers, there is the ability to enact a lot more change as society because of transparency and knowing what is actually going on. On that point, I would like to invite Professor Roy Crawford back off for some closing words. We will be meeting for drinks. The speakers will be around at the Opus just outside, so if you have got any further questions for them, please feel free to join us. Professor Roy Crawford.
Okay. Just very quickly to round off the evening, can I thank all of you for coming along and showing an interest in this first of our winter lecture series. And on your behalf, can I thank Heather and the panel for their stimulating talks. I'm sure we could go on with an open discussion for quite some time. But as Heather has said, there will be an opportunity outside. There is a pay bar. I have to stress it's a pay bar. And Heather and the team will be there to answer any questions or take part in further discussion. I do have for each of them a small gift from the university just to thank them for their contribution. So if I can present those very quickly. Now, if you have enjoyed the evening and can spread the word to your colleagues and friends, that would be good. Next week, the winter lecture series is about cyber security. We had touched this evening a little bit on the internet and its usefulness in business, but I think we all every day get involved in using the internet, and of course we put in our passwords and then we try to remember what they were. And I saw today in an article that some hackers, I think in Russia, have stolen 1.5 billion passwords, and then you rush to the computer and think, do I need to change mine? Next week the talk will be about cybersecurity. What does it mean for all of us? And we'll have a panel of experts who will be speaking to us about that. So thank you very much for coming along. There is the opportunity to mix and mingle outside, and thank you very much. Thank you.
The University of Waikato, where the world is going.